The auctioneer's gavel was already rising when Letitia Wainwright raised her hand on a pure, reckless whim and changed the entire course of her life without meaning to. It was the first Tuesday of September in 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek, Texas, was doing what small towns in the Western Territories did best when someone else's misfortune presented itself. It was gathering to watch. The auction had been announced 3 weeks prior by a hand-lettered notice nailed to the post outside Beaumont's general store, and it had been the talk of the town ever since. The Dunmore Ranch, all 460 acres of it, was going to the highest bidder. The bank had repossessed it after old Clarence Dunmore had drunk himself into an early grave and left behind nothing but debt, a leaky roof, and a cattle herd reduced to 11 scrawny longhorns who looked as miserable about the whole situation as everyone else. Letitia had come to the auction for the same reason. She'd come to most public events in Redemption Creek since arriving 6 months ago from Philadelphia, because she had nothing better to do. She was 26 years old, recently arrived from the East, and working as the assistant to Mr. Harold Beaumont, who ran both the general store and, unofficially, the town's only postal service. She had a small rented room above the barber shop, a decent enough wardrobe for a woman of modest means, and a persistent, nagging sense that her life had somehow taken a wrong turn somewhere around the Missouri border, and she hadn't quite found the right road back yet. She had come west to visit her cousin Margaret, who had married a cattle rancher 2 years prior. The visit was meant to last 6 weeks. Margaret's husband, a dull and well-meaning man named Gerald Prescott, had suffered a heart episode in the spring, and the couple had packed up and moved back east to be near his family's doctors. Letitia had simply stayed. She wasn't entirely sure why. Philadelphia felt small and stifling in a way she couldn't explain, and Redemption Creek felt like a place where a person might be allowed to take up more space than society typically permitted a woman of her background and circumstances. So she had stayed, and she had taken the job with Mr. Beaumont, and she had attended the Dunmore Ranch auction on a warm Tuesday morning with no intention of bidding on anything at all. The crowd that had gathered in the dusty square outside the courthouse numbered perhaps 60 people. There were neighboring ranchers who'd come to assess what they might add to their own holdings, a few land speculators from Austin who wore clean boots and looked at everything with calculating eyes, the town's mayor and his wife, several cowboys leaning against the fence posts with their arms crossed and their hats pulled low against the morning sun, and various townspeople who'd come purely for the spectacle. The auctioneer was a reedy little man named Potts who wore a stovepipe hat that seemed comically tall even by the standards of the day. He launched into his patter with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who found genuine joy in the chaos of bidding wars, describing the property with a generosity of language that bordered on outright fiction. 460 acres of prime Texas grazing land, he announced, though everyone in attendance knew the western quarter of the property was mostly rock and scrub brush. A fine main house with 3 bedrooms and a covered porch. He did not mention that the porch had partially collapsed, or that the roof over the eastern bedroom leaked so badly that Clarence Dunmore's housekeeper had quit in the spring of 1876 and never returned. 11 head of longhorn cattle, a barn, a smokehouse, 2 water wells, and a creek that runs year-round. The creek part was true, at least. Redemption Creek itself ran along the northern edge of the property, which was the only reason it still had any value at all. The bidding opened at $800 and climbed slowly. The land speculators from Austin dropped out early, having apparently gotten a closer look at the property the day before and reached unfavorable conclusions. 2 neighboring ranchers, a heavy-set man named Colquhoun and an older fellow called Ramsay, traded bids in the methodical way of men who have done this before and know exactly how much they're willing to spend. A few others joined in half-heartedly, then thought better of it. It was during a lull in the bidding, when Colquhoun and Ramsay were both scratching their heads and seeming to recalculate, that Letitia heard the woman standing beside her, a merchant's wife named Clara Hobbs, lean toward her neighbor and whisper, "I wonder if they'll have to give it away. They say the house isn't worth the wood it's built from." And Clara's neighbor whispered back, "I heard the barn roof is completely gone on the east side. A strong wind would take the whole thing down." And Clara Hobbs laughed and said, very quietly, "You'd have to pay me to take it." Something in Letitia, some small mischievous part of her that had been somewhat dormant since arriving in Redemption Creek, sat up and took notice. The bidding was at $950. Colquhoun raised it to $1,000. Ramsay paused, tapping his boot in the dust. Without allowing herself to think about it because thinking would have stopped her, Letitia raised her hand and said, in a clear, steady voice that surprised even herself, $1,025. The crowd around her went very quiet for a moment in the particular way that crowds do when something unexpected has happened, and everyone is trying to figure out what it means. Clara Hobbs turned and stared at her with wide eyes. Colquhoun looked over his shoulder with a frown. Ramsay squinted at her from beneath the brim of his hat. The auctioneer, delighted by the development, swept his gaze back to the other bidders with renewed energy. "I have $10.25 from the lady. Do I hear $10.50? $10.50, gentlemen." Ramsay shook his head and stepped back. He was done. Colquhoun narrowed his eyes and studied Letitia for a moment, as if trying to determine whether she was a legitimate bidder or simply making trouble. He must have decided she was the latter, because he crossed his arms and said nothing. "Going once," Potts announced, his gavel already rising. "Going twice." Letitia had a single crystalline moment in which she understood that she could still lower her hand. She could laugh and say she'd made a mistake. Everyone would understand. It would be a moment's embarrassment and nothing more. She did not lower her hand. The gavel came down. "Sold to Mrs. Letitia said automatically, though she wasn't one. The correction came from habit, from some self-preserving instinct honed by years of navigating a world that treated unmarried women as either pitiable or suspect. She cleared her throat. "Miss Wainwright, Letitia Wainwright." The auctioneer beamed at her. "Congratulations, Miss Wainwright. You are the proud new owner of the Dunmore Ranch." The crowd applauded with a kind of amused uncertainty. Clara Hobbs grabbed her arm and said, in a scandalized undertone, "Letitia, what on earth have you done?" Letitia looked at the woman, then looked back at the auctioneer's platform, then said the only honest thing she could think of, "I have absolutely no idea." The bank's representative, a tight-looking man named Aldous Fike, appeared at her elbow within minutes. He was all business, explaining that the deed transfer would require a formal signing, that the necessary paperwork would be prepared and ready by the following morning, that the full purchase price was due upon signing, and that the property transferred in its current condition with no warranty of any kind. Letitia listened to all of this with the distant, slightly unreal feeling of a woman who has stepped into a river and is only now beginning to register how cold it is. She had $1,025 in a savings account at the First Territorial Bank. She had put it there over the past 4 years from her savings in Philadelphia, money set aside from her work as a seamstress and later as a bookkeeper, because she had always believed in having a reserve, in having something that was entirely her own and beholden to no one. She had never once imagined spending it on 460 acres of broken-down Texas land with 11 pathetic longhorns and a barn that was losing the argument with gravity. She signed the preliminary documents that afternoon because apparently that was the sort of woman she was. It wasn't until she was walking home along the unpaved main street of Redemption Creek, the sun sitting heavy and golden on the western ridgeline, that the full weight of what she had done descended on her. She stopped in the middle of the street, completely still, while a horse and wagon rattled past her and raised a cloud of dust, and she stood there thinking about the fact that she owned a ranch. She didn't know the first thing about ranching. She could sew beautifully. She was an excellent bookkeeper. She could bake a respectable loaf of bread, and she could ride a horse adequately, though not with anything approaching skill. She did not know how to repair a roof, or how to mend a fence line, or how to manage cattle, or how to do any one of the 100 practical things that running a ranch required. She needed help. That much was immediately apparent. The problem presented itself to her that evening as she sat in the small dining room of Mrs. Henley's boarding house. She'd taken dinner there as a treat to herself, needing the company, picking at a plate of roasted chicken and trying to think practically. She needed a ranch hand, possibly several. She needed someone who knew the land and knew cattle and knew how to keep a property from falling completely apart. She needed, in short, a foreman. And she needed one who would work for whatever terms she could negotiate, because her finances after this purchase were going to be considerably tighter than they had been this morning. Mrs. Henley herself, a broad, warm woman of 55 who had opinions about everything and shared them freely, set down a cup of coffee at Letitia's elbow and said, without preamble, "You'll want Edwin Fletcher." Letitia looked up. "I beg your pardon, for the ranch." Mrs. Henley settled into the chair across from her with the comfortable authority of a woman who is used to being listened to. "If you're going to do anything useful with the Dunmore place, you'll want Edwin Fletcher. He knows that land better than anyone alive. Used to work it for Clarence Dunmore before all the troubles." "And where would I find this Edwin Fletcher?" Letitia asked. Mrs. Henley looked at her with a mild sort of pity. "Honey, right now, the most likely place to find Edwin Fletcher is at the bottom of a whiskey glass at the Silver Spur. That's where he's been most evenings this past year." She paused. "He's had a difficult time of it. Don't let that put you off. There's not a finer hand in this county, and he's got a good heart underneath all that trouble." Letitia drank her coffee and looked at the flame in the oil lamp on the table and thought about this. Then she said, "What sort of trouble?" Mrs. Henley folded her hands on the table. "He came out here from Tennessee about 5 years back, built himself a small place of his own east of town, married a woman named Pearl. They had a baby daughter." She paused. "Pearl and the baby both died in childbirth winter before last. Edwin hasn't been quite right since." She said it with the direct compassion of a woman who has seen grief and doesn't flinch from naming it. "He sold his own place and went to work for Dunmore, which was a mistake because Dunmore was already going under by then. And then when Dunmore passed, there was nothing left for Edwin to do but drift. He's been doing odd jobs. He's 30 years old and he's living like a man who's given up deciding what comes next." Letitia sat with this for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll speak to him in the morning." "You might want to go tonight," Mrs. Henley said, with a practical air, "before Colquhoun sends someone to offer him work. Colquhoun wanted that ranch, and he'll be looking to put together a crew to make another bid if yours falls through." Letitia looked down at her half-eaten plate of chicken. She thought about the deed she would be signing in the morning. She thought about 460 acres and 11 bewildered longhorns and a barn with a failing roof. She pushed back her chair. "Could you wrap that chicken up for me?" she said. "I may need to eat it later." The Silver Spur Saloon sat at the far end of Redemption Creek's Main Street, 3 buildings past the blacksmith's shop, and it announced itself with a yellow lamplight that spilled out under the swinging doors and a piano playing something that had probably been a proper song at one point and was now merely a suggestion of one. Letitia pushed through the doors with the expression of a woman who had decided not to be intimidated by her surroundings, a decision she found she had to actively renew with every step. The saloon was not full, it being a weeknight, but there were enough men present that her entrance drew the full attention of the room in about 3 seconds. She squared her shoulders and looked around. She found Edwin Fletcher in the back corner without much difficulty because he was the only man in the room sitting alone and staring at the surface of the table as if expecting it to say something useful. He had a glass in front of him, half full of amber liquid, and he hadn't touched it for a while judging by the stillness of the condensation ring around its base. He was lean in the way of men who work hard and sometimes forget to eat, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed shaving, and the particular stillness of a man who has taught himself not to want too much from any given moment. Letitia crossed the room, pulled out the chair across from him without being invited, and sat down. Edwin Fletcher looked up at her with the unhurried blink of a man who has been some distance away in his own thoughts and is making the journey back. His eyes were dark, a deep brown that in the lamplight looked almost black, and they took her in with a directness that was neither rude nor entirely polite, just honest. He was, she registered in some detached corner of her awareness, a handsome man in a severe and somewhat battered way. He looked like a man who had been carefully constructed and then not particularly well looked after. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "my name is Letitia Wainwright. I've been told you're the best ranch hand in this county." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, who told you that, Mrs. Henley?" He considered this. "She's a kind woman." He said it without inflection, which could have meant he agreed with her assessment or was politely disputing it. "I bought the Dunmore Ranch today," Letitia said. She decided to be direct because indirectness seemed like it would cost her time she didn't have, and also because she had a feeling this man would see through it anyway. "I know very little about ranching, and I am aware that the property is in poor condition. I need a foreman, someone who can help me understand what I've gotten myself into and help me decide what to do about it." She paused. "I can offer you a room in the bunkhouse, which Mrs. Henley tells me is in better shape than the main house, a fair wage which we can negotiate, and a percentage of any profit the ranch turns in its first year, should there be any, which there may not be." Edwin Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his whiskey glass and set it back down without drinking. "You bought the Dunmore place," he said, "and it wasn't quite a question. This morning. I'm signing the deed tomorrow." She paused. "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Fletcher. I didn't entirely mean to buy it, but I've signed the papers and I'm committed, and I'd rather be honest about my situation than pretend to a confidence I haven't earned." Something shifted in his expression at that, very slightly, like a door that has been sealed for a long time and just moved a quarter of an inch. "You didn't mean to buy a ranch," he said. "I raised my hand at the auction somewhat on impulse," she said. "And then the bidding ended rather more quickly than I expected." He was quiet for another moment, and then something happened that she didn't expect. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, nothing so generous as that, but a small, reluctant acknowledgement that this was at least mildly absurd. "You bid on it as a joke," he said. "I wouldn't say a joke exactly," she said. "More of an impulse without full consideration of consequences." "Same thing," he said. "Perhaps," she allowed. He looked at the whiskey glass again. He looked at the table. He looked at her, and something in his gaze was different this time, more present, as if some distant part of him had been recalled to attention by the sheer improbability of the situation. "The east wing of the barn is gone," he said. "The roof came down in the ice storm last January. The main house has a bedroom that's been open to the sky since spring. The creek fence line hasn't been maintained in 2 years, so the cattle have been wandering, and that's why there are only 11 of them, the rest having made the acquaintance of neighboring properties." He paused. "The water wells are sound, which is the best thing I can say. And the land itself, the soil in the southern quarter especially, is some of the best grazing land in this part of the territory. Dunmore didn't deserve what he had." She recognized that he was telling her the truth without dressing it up, and she was grateful for it. "How much can be saved?" she asked. "Most of it," he said after a moment. "With the right work and the right timing." He paused. "And with someone who knows what they're doing." "Then I need you," she said simply. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he was going to say no. He turned the whiskey glass in a slow circle with his fingers, not drinking, just turning it, and she had the impression that the motion was something he did when he was thinking, a habit of the hands. "I'll come out and look at it tomorrow," he said finally. "After you've signed the deed. I want to see it before I commit to anything." "That's entirely fair," she said. "And the wages," he said. "We'll talk about those after I've seen the condition of things." I won't take a wage that'll break you before the ranch has a chance to get on its feet." This surprised her. She had expected negotiation, even some hardness. She hadn't expected consideration. "All right," she said. He picked up the whiskey glass, looked at it for a moment, then set it down again with an air of finality and pushed it slightly away from him. "I'll meet you at the courthouse at 9, he said. "You can show me the deed and we'll go out together." She stood, because there didn't seem to be anything else to say, and she had learned at a young age that a conversation ended well was better than one prolonged past its natural close. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher." He nodded once, short and spare. She walked back through the saloon and out through the swinging doors, and didn't let herself turn around to see if he watched her go. He was at the courthouse at 5 minutes to 9. She noticed that he had shaved, and that his hair was somewhat more orderly than the evening before, and that he wore a clean shirt in a dark blue chambray that had been carefully pressed. He was leaning against the courthouse wall with his hat in his hands, turning it the same way he'd turned the whiskey glass, and when he saw her coming, he stood straight and put the hat back on his head with the naturalness of a man who has worn one all his life. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher," she said. "Miss Wainwright," he said. The deed signing took 40 minutes, during which Aldous Fike from the bank was efficient and impersonal, and Letitia signed her name in 6 different places and handed over a bank draft that represented essentially everything she had saved in 4 years. By the time she walked back out into the September morning sun, she owned a ranch in every legal sense that the state of Texas recognized. Edwin had waited outside. She came out to find him sitting on the courthouse steps with his elbows on his knees and his gaze on the middle distance, and when she appeared he rose without being asked. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "I am officially the owner of 460 acres and 11 unhappy cattle." He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of slightly reluctant attention she'd noticed the evening before, as if he was recalibrating something. Then he turned and nodded toward the hitching post where 2 horses were tied. "I brought a spare. Mrs. Henley told me you'd need one." The kindness of this small practical thing, offered without ceremony, landed in her chest with a warmth she hadn't expected. "She thinks of everything," Letitia said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and handed her the reins of a calm-looking gray mare with a white blaze. They rode out to the ranch in the bright September morning with the sky enormous and blue above them, and the scrub grass rolling away on every side, gold and amber, and occasionally, where a wash ran close to the surface, a deep persistent green. The road from town was little more than a pair of wheel tracks through the brush, and Edwin rode beside her in an easy silence that she found, to her mild surprise, not uncomfortable at all. He was a man who seemed to understand that not every silence needed filling, which in her experience was a quality more rare than it should have been. When they crested the low rise that gave the first full view of the Dunmore property, Letitia stopped her horse without meaning to and simply looked. It was both better and worse than she had imagined. The house was a low, spreading structure of weathered timber with a wide porch along the front, and from this distance, the collapsed section on the east end wasn't immediately obvious. The land around it was open and generous, with the pale ribbon of the creek visible through the cottonwood trees along the north edge, and the round backs of the distant hills giving everything a sense of being held and contained in a way that was somehow comforting rather than confining. The barn was large, or had been, and its bones were clearly good even where the eastern roof line drooped toward the earth. There was a smokehouse and a root cellar, and what looked like the remnants of a kitchen garden gone to seed. But it was the light that got her. The morning light lay across the land with a particular generosity, making even the broken-down portions of it look like they were trying their best, like they were waiting for someone to believe in them again. "It's not without promise," she said, and then felt slightly embarrassed by the sentiment. But Edwin, beside her on his bay gelding, looked at the property with an expression she couldn't quite read, something complicated that moved through his face like weather. "No," he said quietly, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment and then added, as if the words cost him something, I spent 2 years on this land. I know every inch of it. She didn't say anything to that, understanding somehow that it required nothing from her. They rode down to the property, and Edwin gave her a full tour with a thoroughness that was both methodical and honest. He showed her the main house room by room, the 3 bedrooms, 2 of which were sound and 1 of which had a hole in the roof the size of a wagon wheel, the kitchen, which had a good cast iron stove and solid shelving but desperately needed cleaning, the sitting room, which was simply dusty and unused and otherwise intact, the root cellar, which was dry and good. He showed her the barn and pointed out exactly which beams had failed and which were sound. He walked her along the fence lines, showing her where the cattle had gotten through and where repairs were needed. He showed her the creek, which ran clean and cold over smooth brown stones, and the 2 wells, both of which produced good water. He showed her the pasture land in the southern quarter where the grama grass grew thick and tall. Through all of this he was clear-eyed and direct, pointing out problems without exaggeration and also without false reassurance, and noting the genuine strengths of the property with equal honesty. It struck her, watching him, that he was a man who had a fundamental respect for truth, who found comfort in the accurate assessment of things rather than in flattering illusions. By the time they came back to stand in the shade of the cottonwood trees beside the creek, she had a much clearer picture of what she was dealing with, and it was daunting, but it was not hopeless. "What would you do first?" she asked. He pushed his hat back and looked at the house. "Roof on the main house before the autumn rains start. That's urgent. Then the barn, because you need a sound place to keep the cattle through the winter. Then the south fence line to keep the herd from wandering further." He paused. "It's work for 2 men at minimum, probably 3. You'll need to hire hands. How much will that cost?" He gave her a number, broken down by task, speaking from clear knowledge rather than estimate. She did quick mental arithmetic and arrived at a figure that was uncomfortable but possible, if the ranch could begin generating some income before the coming spring. She asked him about the cattle, and whether the 11 remaining longhorns could be supplemented, and he told her about a rancher 2 counties over who was selling off part of a herd due to drought conditions, and said that he could likely negotiate a reasonable price for 20 additional head. She looked at him and said, "Are you going to take the job then?" He looked back at her with those dark eyes that seemed to be perpetually in the process of weighing things. The morning had gone soft and warm around them, the creek talking quietly over its stones, a red-tailed hawk circling on a thermal high above the south pasture. "I'll take it," he said. "We'll settle wages when we get back to town. Fair pay, and I don't need the percentage share. Keep that for yourself." "I want you to have a stake in this," she said. "It'll mean more if you have something to gain from it beyond a wage." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I'll have something to gain from it," he said. "That's enough." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that, but something in the way he said it made her decide not to press. They settled the wage arrangement that afternoon, sitting in 2 chairs on the sagging front porch of the ranch house, while the September sun climbed toward noon, and it was a fair arrangement that gave Edwin Fletcher a monthly wage, room in the bunkhouse, and meals taken in the main house kitchen, which Letitia quietly committed to herself to make worth eating. She could cook adequately, she could learn to cook well, which in her experience was usually how these things went. Edwin moved his few belongings out to the ranch that same evening. He had very little: a bedroll, a saddlebag, a rifle, and a small wooden box that he set on the bunkhouse shelf with a care that suggested it mattered considerably. She didn't ask about the box. There were things a person kept to themselves, and she understood that. The first week was a revelation. Edwin arrived at the kitchen door each morning at 6, and they would drink coffee together at the kitchen table while he outlined the day's work with a clarity and organization that she found deeply reassuring. He was a man who knew how to work, not just the physical work, which he did with an unfussy competence that impressed her enormously, but the thinking work that went before and after, the planning and the problem-solving that kept a property moving forward. He assessed, he prioritized, he executed. He didn't complain. He didn't make the work seem heroic or arduous. He simply did it. He hired 2 men by the end of the first week. A young fellow named Cody Marsh, who was 19 and strong as a draft horse, and cheerfully willing to do whatever was asked, and an older Mexican man named Rodrigo Salinas, who had been working for wages in the territory for 20 years and knew cattle and fence work with the mastery of long practice. Edwin treated Rodrigo with an easy, uncomplicated respect that Letitia noticed and approved of, particularly given how some men in the territory treated anyone who wasn't Anglo by birth. The roof work on the main house began on the 3rd day. Edwin and Cody worked at it for 4 full days while Rodrigo took charge of the fence repairs, and Letitia spent those days both helping where she could and working on the interior of the house, scrubbing and cleaning and mending and organizing, gradually transforming the state of neglect and dust into something that began to feel like a place where a person might actually want to live. In the evenings, after supper, Edwin would sometimes sit on the porch while the sun went down and the sky turned the particular shades of gold and rose and deep blue that seemed unique to this part of Texas. And sometimes she would sit out there too, and they would talk or not talk as the mood was. She learned, piece by piece and day by day, who he was. He had grown up in eastern Tennessee, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher. He had come west at 25 after the death of his father left the family in a debt he'd helped clear but couldn't quite recover from financially, drawn by the possibility of land of his own, and a life built from scratch on a frontier that was less decided than the established East. He had built his own place with his own hands, and when he spoke of that he did so with a controlled pride that told her it had meant a great deal to him. He spoke of Pearl rarely and obliquely, and Letitia did not press. She had enough sense to understand that grief was not a vault you could simply open when you wanted. She only knew what Mrs. Henley had told her, and she held that knowledge carefully and didn't use it as a wedge. What she discovered, living and working alongside Edwin Fletcher in the broad, honest days of September and October, was that he was a man of considerable substance underneath the damage. He was quiet but not uncommunicative, serious but not without humor. That dry, economical humor she had glimpsed at their first meeting showed itself more and more as the weeks passed, surfacing in small, dry observations that made her laugh in the sudden, uncalculated way she preferred, when laughter came up from somewhere real rather than being performed for social purposes. He was also, she came to understand with a private and somewhat startled clarity, paying attention to her. Not in the manner of a man performing interest, not in the performative way of men who wanted something and were trying to get it. He paid attention to her in the way he paid attention to the land, carefully, and with a kind of respect for what was actually there rather than what he might prefer to see. He noticed, for instance, that she read voraciously and that the absence of books in the ranch house had been quietly distressing her. Without comment, he returned from town one afternoon with a paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be 4 novels from the back shelf of Beaumont's general store, set them on the kitchen table, and went back outside without explanation. She stood holding one in each hand for a moment, and felt something bloom in her chest that was too warm and specific to be simply gratitude. He noticed that she had been struggling with the kitchen stove, which had a temperamental damper that required exactly the right adjustment to draw properly. He showed her the trick of it one morning with a practical patience that accepted entirely her right to learn the thing and manage it herself afterward, and then turned the matter over to her with no further supervision. She noticed, in turn, that he was beginning to sleep and eat like a man who was remembering what those activities were for. The tautness that had been around his eyes when she'd first met him was loosening by degrees. He had not touched alcohol since the evening she'd come to the Silver Spur, which she knew because Mrs. Henley had mentioned it when Letitia came to town for supplies, and also because Edwin himself was simply and evidently clearer every day. He was still a man with grief in him. She didn't fool herself that work and good food and a sound property were sufficient to resolve that. But he was also a man who was, incrementally and with some evident effort, choosing to be present. And being present, she had noticed, seemed to make him somewhat happier. Not dramatically, not with any great declaration, but in the way a plant that has been moved to better light begins to grow toward it without being asked. October deepened and the air turned, gaining the particular clarity and bite of Texas autumn that seemed to sharpen everything at the edges, the distance between things, the colors of the land, the smell of wood smoke from the newly repaired chimney of the main house. The roof was sound. The barn was substantially better, with new framing on the east side and roof boards that would hold through the winter. The cattle, supplemented by 23 additional head that Edwin had acquired from the drought-pressed rancher, now numbered 34 and were being properly managed. Letitia was learning. This seemed important to note, because she was learning things she had never imagined. She would know how to check whether a fence post was properly set, how to read whether coming in from the northwest by the way the cattle stood, how to tell a healthy longhorn from one that was going off its feed. She was not a rancher by any stretch of the definition yet, but she was becoming a rancher's apprentice, and she took to it with a focused intensity that surprised her somewhat. Edwin was a good teacher in the same way he was good at everything practical, clear, patient, and without condescension. He seemed to hold it as self-evident that she was capable of learning whatever he put before her, which meant more to her than most compliments she'd received in her life. It was on a Friday evening in the middle of October, with a cold front coming down from the north and the last of the sunset painting the western ridgeline in deep crimson, that the thing between them shifted. They had been working to bring the cattle in from the south pasture before the weather hit, a task that had gone well enough but had required them both to be in the saddle for 3 hours in the growing chill. They were putting the horses up in the barn, while the wind picked up outside and the cottonwoods along the creek bent and whispered, and somehow in the close warmth of the barn, with the horses breathing and the hay smelling of summer and the outside world turning cold and dark, the ordinary quality of what they were doing together became something she was aware of in a new way. She was brushing down the gray mare when Edwin said, from 2 stalls over, "You sit a horse better than you did 6 weeks ago." "I've had a good teacher," she said without looking up. "You have," he agreed, completely without self-consciousness. She laughed. "That was meant to be a compliment to you, Mr. Fletcher." "I know. I'm agreeing with it." There was a pause, and then she heard the quiet humor in his voice, and it made her smile down at the mare's flank. She heard him moving, the sound of his footsteps in the straw, and then he was leaning against the stall partition beside her, watching her brush the mare with an unhurried regard that she was aware of along the back of her neck and the length of her spine in a way that was new. "Letitia," he said, and the use of her Christian name, which he had not used before, made her still her brush. She looked up at him. The barn lantern threw warm yellow light across the side of his face, and it made him look less severe and more simply himself, a man standing in a barn at the end of a long October day, on the edge of saying something he'd been working up to for some time. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly." "All right," she said. "I came to work on this ranch because I needed work and because you asked me," he said. "That was all it was at the beginning." He paused, looking at her steadily with those dark eyes. "It isn't all it is now." The wind hit the barn roof and moaned through the gaps and then passed. One of the horses shifted its weight. The lantern flame bent slightly and then steadied. Letitia set down the brush on the stall partition. She turned to face him properly. "No," she said, "it isn't all it is for me either." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face did something she'd never seen it do in all the weeks she'd known him. It opened. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Enough that she could see the man behind the damage, and that man was someone she very much wanted to know better. "I'm not easy company," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I've got weight I'm still carrying, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I'm not asking for easy," she said. I'm asking for honest." "That I can do," he said. "Then we're agreed," she said, and held out her hand as if they were concluding a business arrangement, which they both knew they were not, and he looked at her extended hand and then took it and held it, which was not how a business arrangement ended. The warmth of his hand around hers was steady and certain, and she thought that this was how she'd come to think of him, steady and certain, the same qualities she'd originally noted in his work and had slowly come to understand were his essential nature. He was a man who, once he chose to stand somewhere, stood there with his full weight. He walked her back to the main house through the cold wind with the stars obscured by the incoming clouds, and at the porch steps he stopped and looked at her in the darkness, and she looked back at him, and then he said good night, and she said good night, and she went inside. She stood in the kitchen with the warm stove at her back and pressed her hand, the hand he'd held, against her breastbone, and felt her own heartbeat, and thought that this had become something considerably more than a joke about a broken-down ranch. November came in cold and busy, and the work of the ranch continued with all the concentrated effort of a season that would determine whether the first winter would be navigable. Edwin drove the progress forward with a systematic intelligence that Letitia increasingly admired, not just for the labor itself, but for the thinking behind it, the way he read ahead into what winter would require, and positioned the ranch to meet it rather than simply responding to each problem as it arrived. Between them, a careful and tentative thing was growing. It was careful because they were both people who had been shaped by their losses into a certain wariness about what they reached for, and it was tentative because neither of them was the sort to rush at something important. But it was real. That much was unmistakable. It showed in the particular quality of attention they paid each other, in the easy silences that had become comfortable rather than neutral, in the way a day that had started before they'd seen each other was slightly different from one that had begun with coffee at the kitchen table. He brought her wildflowers once, in the last warm week of October before the hard frost started, a loose, awkward bunch of Indian paintbrush and goldenrod gathered along the creek bank, and he set them on the kitchen table with a brusqueness that couldn't quite disguise the fact that he'd picked them with intention. She put them in a glass of water, and he looked at them there on the table, and a muscle moved in his jaw in the way that told her he was pleased, which she had learned to read as its own kind of eloquence. She told him about Philadelphia and about her life there, about her parents, both deceased now, her father a printer who had loved words and her mother a woman of considerable practical intelligence, who had passed both her love of books and her gift for bookkeeping on to her only daughter. She told him about the slow claustrophobia that had settled on her there, the sense of being too large a person for the space allocated to her by convention. She told him about the cousin and the visit, and the odd chain of events that had led her to staying in Redemption Creek. He told her more about Tennessee, and about the years of building his own place east of town, and he told her, in fragments and carefully, something about Pearl. His wife had been a gentle and cheerful woman who had wanted the western frontier as much as he had, who had loved the land with a passion that matched his own, and who had died in a January ice storm in a childbirth that had gone wrong in ways the doctor in town had not been able to prevent. He told her this on a cold November evening while they sat at the kitchen table after supper, and his voice was even and controlled, but his hands were still around his coffee cup, in the way they went still when he was holding something in check. She didn't say the things people usually said, because she understood that those things, however well-meaning, were inadequate to the specific weight of what he was carrying. She said, "I'm very sorry, Edwin," using his Christian name for the first time, and meant it completely. He looked at her and nodded once, and the acknowledgement that passed between them in that moment was one of the most honest things she had experienced in a long time. He said, after a moment, "I want you to know that what I feel for you, what I've been feeling these past weeks, it isn't instead of that. It isn't something I'm using to forget it." She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that she was not a remedy or a distraction. "I know that," she said. "I needed to say it plainly," he said. "I know that too," she said, and he looked at her with an expression that held something she could only describe as relief, as if he had been carrying a concern that he'd been unable to set down, and she had just offered him a place to put it. It was the 1st of December, on a cold, clear afternoon with the sun low and pale on the western hills, and the cattle settled on the pasture, when Edwin kissed her for the first time. They had been mending the last section of the north fence line, a task that had taken all day, and they were putting the tools back in the wagon to head back to the house when she turned to say something to him and found him very close and looking at her with an attention so direct and unguarded that it stopped the words in her throat. He said, "I'd like to kiss you." Very simple, very direct. The way he said everything that mattered. She said, "Yes." He kissed her with a care and thoroughness that she would have expected of a man who did nothing by half measures. She kissed him back the same way, because she was not a woman who did things by half measures either. They stood in the cold December afternoon beside a wagon with a load of fence-mending tools, and the pasture spreading out around them, and the creek muttering in the distance. And it was not a setting that any novel would have described as romantic, and she thought it was the most romantic thing that had ever happened to her. When they separated, they stood looking at each other for a moment, and then Edwin said, in a tone that was trying for ordinary and not quite making it, "We should get back before dark." "Yes," she said, feeling warmth in her face despite the cold air. "The cattle will need to be checked," he said. "Yes," she said again. "Right," he said, and they climbed onto the wagon and drove back toward the house in a silence that was so charged it nearly had mass, and it was one of the finest silences Letitia Wainwright had ever sat in. December was good and busy and full of the particular pleasure of a ranch that was finding its feet. The cattle were wintering well. The house was warm and tight against the weather. Cody Marsh had turned out to be worth his wage twice over, and had developed a genuine affection for the work that made him a pleasure to have around. Rodrigo Salinas had the south fence line in better condition than it had been in years. Edwin and Letitia had settled into a new configuration, one that was quieter on the outside than it was on the inside. They were still what they had been, employer and foreman, two people running a ranch together, and they were also something else, something still being defined but growing clearer every day. He kissed her in the barn and in the kitchen and once, memorably, in the middle of the south pasture when they had ridden out to check on the herd, and had found themselves alone under a sky so wide and blue it felt like being inside something rather than outside anything. She said to him once, on a December evening when the fire was going and the wind was doing something theatrical with the cottonwoods, "Do you think this was all just good fortune, or do you think we would have found our way to each other somehow, some other way, if things had been different?" He looked at the fire and then at her. "I'm not a man who believes in inevitable things," he said. "I think you raised your hand at an auction, and I think I said yes when I might have said no, and I think we both made choices that got us here." He paused. "I think it matters more that it was choices than that it was fate. Fate doesn't require anything of you. Choices do." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very good answer," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a few weeks," he admitted, and she laughed in the real, sudden way that she loved, and he looked at her with an expression that was, unmistakably, love, not the first wild heat of it, but something steadier and deeper, the kind that has survived its own examination and decided to stay. Christmas came and brought the three ranch hands Cody, Rodrigo, and the new third man Edwin had hired in November, a quiet and competent man from Arkansas named Thomas who preferred to be called Tom, and whose last name, he explained cheerfully, was not one that needed recording for any official purpose together at the main house for Christmas dinner. Letitia had cooked for 3 days in preparation, and the result was a meal that filled the kitchen table entirely and spilled onto the sideboard, and was received with the wordless gratitude of men who had not had a proper Christmas dinner in years. Edwin sat at the end of the table and looked at the people gathered around it, and Letitia caught him doing it, caught that particular quality of his attention moving around the room with something that was close to wonder, as if he was accounting for something he had not expected to find himself in possession of, and she felt her heart make a sound in her chest like a door opening onto a warm room. After the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the dishes were washed and the fire was burning low, Edwin reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object wrapped in brown paper and string and set it on the table between them. She looked at it and then at him. "Edwin." "It's Christmas," he said, in the same tone he used when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him, which always told her quite clearly that it did. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small brooch of silver, a sprig of something botanical that she thought was meant to be bluebonnets, the Texas state flower, worked in delicate detail by a silversmith's hand. It was not expensive, but it was beautiful, and it was specific chosen, not simply bought, and that specificity hit her somewhere under her breastbone with considerable force. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice did something that she didn't try to control. He looked at her steadily and said, "I want to court you properly, Letitia. I want to do this right." She looked at the brooch in her hand and then at him. "You have been courting me properly," she said, "for 2 months. Then I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "eventually. I'm not asking tonight. I want to be on steadier ground before I ask, but I wanted you to know that that's where I'm heading." She looked at him for a moment and thought about everything she knew about Edwin Fletcher, the way he worked and the way he thought, and the way he was honest even when honesty was difficult, and the way he'd set those books on the kitchen table without fanfare, and the way he held her hand in the barn on a cold night while the wind blew, and the way grief had not made him smaller, just different. She thought about all of that, and then she said, "Edwin, the ground is already steady." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he said, in a voice that had gone somewhat rough at the edges, "Then I'm asking you now." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the firelight on Christmas night in 1878, with the cold outside and the warmth inside and the smell of the good dinner still in the air, and she said, "Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it the way he had in the barn, with that quality of steadiness that she had understood from the very beginning was the most essential thing about him. The winter of 1878 rolling into 1879 was cold and sometimes difficult and almost entirely good. Edwin and Letitia announced their engagement in January to the general delight of Mrs. Henley, who said she had seen it coming since the morning after the auction, and to the resigned approval of Mr. Beaumont, who had been hoping Letitia might continue working for him indefinitely. There were some in Redemption Creek who had opinions about a woman who ran her own ranch and was marrying her foreman, and these opinions were aired in various corners. But Letitia had developed, over the course of the autumn and winter, a solid immunity to opinions that were not grounded in anything she was obligated to care about. The spring brought the real test of what the ranch could become. Edwin had spent the winter planning with a forwardness that Letitia had come to recognize as one of his core gifts, the ability to see 3 steps ahead and position accordingly. He had identified a market in the growing cattle trade routes, had negotiated a modest arrangement with a cattle buyer from San Antonio who was building a reliable supply chain, and had laid out a grazing rotation that would let the land regenerate while still supporting a growing herd. By March of 1879, the ranch that Letitia had accidentally bought for $1,025 at a Tuesday morning auction was beginning to produce income. Not dramatically, not extravagantly, but genuinely actual cash money returning on actual work, which in ranching was not guaranteed and was therefore to be received with appropriate gratitude. She sat down one evening in early March with her ledger books, which she kept with the careful precision of the bookkeeper she had trained as, and added up the columns and looked at the bottom line, and allowed herself, privately and without performance, a moment of pure satisfaction. Then she went outside and found Edwin checking the north fence line in the late afternoon light, and she told him the numbers. He listened with his hat pushed back and his hands in his jacket pockets, and when she finished he looked at the fence post for a moment and said, "We can afford to add 15 more head in the fall." "We can," she agreed. "And fix the smokehouse roof," he said, "and put new boards on the bunkhouse floor before Tom's complaints about the drafts become a formal grievance." "They will not be a formal grievance," she said. "Tom barely says 10 words a day." "9 of them are about those floor boards," Edwin said, with the dry precision of a man who has been listening to exactly this. She laughed, and he smiled at her, a full, unguarded smile that she was still collecting the way she'd once collected pressed flowers as a girl, pressing them flat in the pages of her memory because they were that worth keeping. They were married in May of 1879. On a Saturday afternoon in the little white church that sat on the hill at the north end of Redemption Creek. It was not a large wedding, because neither of them had the temperament for theatrical productions, but it was well attended by the town and by the various people who had become part of their lives over the months. Mrs. Henley in her best dress with an expression of well-earned satisfaction, Cody Marsh looking uncomfortable in a borrowed jacket, Rodrigo Salinas and his wife Maria, who had driven in from their home outside town, Tom with his hair combed for apparently the first time in living memory. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself from a pale blue fabric that she had ordered from San Antonio, because she could sew well, she could sew beautifully, and she was not going to be married in anything less than something she'd put her own hands to. She wore the silver bluebonnet brooch at her collar. She carried a small bunch of the same wildflowers that Edwin had brought her in that last warm week of October, because she had asked him to find them and he had, because that was the kind of man he was. Edwin stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that he had clearly bought new for the occasion, and wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man more at home in working clothes. And when he saw her walking down the aisle, his face did the thing she loved. It opened. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Caldwell, a Presbyterian minister of gentle temperament, who conducted the words of the rite with a dignity that made them feel earned and specific rather than routine. When Edwin said, "I will," he said it with the quality of everything she had come to know about him: direct, considered, absolutely meant. She said "I will" with equal conviction, because she had never been a person who said things she didn't mean, and she meant this with her full self. The reception was held in the churchyard, and then at the Silver Spur, which had been transformed for the occasion by the addition of paper lanterns and a cleared dance floor and a fiddler and a guitar player, who knew between them enough songs to keep things going until well past dark. Letitia danced with Edwin, who turned out to be a better dancer than she'd expected and seemed slightly amused by her surprise, and he said into her hair when they were turning slowly in the lamplight, "My mother made me learn. She said it was a necessary skill." "Your mother was right about everything," Letitia said. "She was," he said. "I'll tell you all the other things she was right about sometime." "I look forward to it," she said, and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and felt his arm tighten around her, and thought that she had not felt this particular quality of contentment since she was a child in her father's study with a book and a fire, and the sense that everything was exactly as it should be. They went back to the ranch that night under a sky full of stars, riding side by side in the warm May dark, and the ranch house had a light in the window that Edwin had left burning, and it looked like what it was, a home. The summer of 1879 was productive and warm and full of work, and full of the particular texture of a life that is being built by two people who are genuinely suited to the task. Letitia had by now a working competence in most aspects of the ranch's daily operation, not because she felt required to prove herself, but because she found genuine satisfaction in understanding the thing she owned and the life she was living from the ground up. Edwin worked alongside her with a collaborative ease that neither subordinated her judgment nor performed deference to it, just treated it as what it was, another point of view worth weighing, from someone he trusted. They argued sometimes, because they were both people who had opinions and the courage of them. Their arguments were occasionally heated and always short because they were both too honest to sustain a position they couldn't defend and too pragmatic to prioritize winning over getting the right answer. They always resolved. They always went to bed on the same side of things, not because either of them suppressed their disagreement, but because they were both committed to working through it. It was in late August that Letitia realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she told Edwin, not because she doubted what his response would be, but because she wanted a day in which the knowledge was entirely her own, to turn over and examine from every angle. She walked the south pasture in the early morning and the north fence line in the afternoon, and let the fact of it settle into her with the careful attending of a woman who understands that some things need space before they need words. She told him that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in the long golden light of an August evening, plainly and directly. He was very still for a moment. The stillness that she had learned to read as his processing something important, not absence but the deepest form of presence. Then he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It held everything, joy and wonder and a deep, specific tenderness that acknowledged everything she wasn't saying out loud. That this was also a kind of inheritance from his loss, that she knew what it had cost him, that she was asking nothing of him except to be here for it. "Letitia," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "We're going to be all right," she said, because she knew that was part of what he needed to hear. Not that it would be easy, but that they would be all right. He reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was shaking slightly, which was the only time she had ever seen him shake at anything, and she held it firmly. "Yes," he said. "We are." They were. The pregnancy progressed through the fall and into the early winter of 1879 with what the doctor in Redemption Creek, a practical and straightforward man named Dr. Holt, described as remarkable straightforwardness. Letitia was healthy and capable, and continued to work the ranch with appropriate modifications. And Edwin was attentive in a way that managed to be watchful without being stifling, which she deeply appreciated. He built the nursery himself, converting the smaller of the 3 bedrooms, not the repaired one, the original sound one, with a care and thoroughness that she watched with a full heart. He built the cradle himself as well, working in the barn in the evenings by lamplight, measuring and joining pieces of good walnut wood with a carpenter's precision inherited from his father. And when he brought it inside and set it in the nursery, he stood looking at it for a moment with his hands at his sides, and an expression she was wise enough not to interrupt. Their son was born in April of 1880, on a Tuesday, which Letitia found quietly and privately amusing, given that it was a Tuesday auction that had started all of this. He was born in the sound bedroom with Dr. Holt in attendance and Mrs. Henley, who had appointed herself to the role of supporting presence with a cheerful authority that no one had thought to question, and Cody Marsh pacing the front porch for 3 hours until Edwin came out to tell him the news, and he took off his hat and pressed it against his chest with the expression of a man who has just been told something that required a new response to existence. Edwin held his son in the bedroom doorway, this man who had lost so much and built so much and chosen, carefully and consciously, to remain present in the face of everything, held this small boy with the precision and gentleness of a man who understands exactly what he is holding, and Letitia watched from the bed and felt a love for him so large it was almost impractical. "What should we call him?" she asked. Edwin looked at the baby for a long time. "James," he said. "My father's name." "James Fletcher," she said. "That's a good name." "James William Fletcher," he said. "If that's all right with you, William was your father's name." She had told him her father's name one evening in November, in passing, in the context of a story about a book her father had loved. The fact that he had held on to it, that he had thought to put it here, landed in her the same way the books on the kitchen table had, the same way the flowers had, the same way all the small and careful attentions had, like light landing on a surface that was very glad to receive it. "Yes," she said, with a voice that was not entirely steady. "That's exactly right." The ranch grew. Not spectacularly, not overnight, but in the steady, practical way of a thing that has been built correctly from good materials by people who understand the work. By the summer of 1880, the herd numbered over 60 head, and the arrangement with the San Antonio buyer was generating consistent income. The south fence line was the best it had ever been. The east wing of the barn had been entirely rebuilt and was now, by Edwin's assessment, sounder than the original. Tom had stopped complaining about the bunkhouse floor because Edwin and Cody had replaced it in the spring. Rodrigo Salinas had brought his wife Maria to live in a small house that Edwin and the Hands had built on the eastern edge of the property, a practical arrangement that kept Rodrigo close and gave the ranch something closer to a small community than a solitary enterprise, which Letitia found she preferred enormously. Maria Salinas was a woman of great warmth and considerable practical ability who became, without formal arrangement, Letitia's closest companion in the work of daily life and the management of the house and garden and the early care of baby James. The town of Redemption Creek was, in 1880, growing with some of the energy of the territory's general expansion. New businesses had opened on the main street. The church had been expanded. There was talk of a school being properly established, rather than the informal arrangement that had prevailed. Letitia involved herself in this last cause with the particular enthusiasm of a woman who had been raised by a school teacher and knew the value of a thing, attending the town meetings on the subject, and speaking with a directness that initially surprised some of the men present and eventually earned their grudging respect, largely because she was always right, and also because she brought the meeting coffee which was uniformly excellent. The matter of the school was settled in the fall of 1880, when the town voted to fund a proper schoolhouse and hired a teacher from Kansas City named Miss Abernathy, who was 23 and more than capable of managing a room full of frontier children. Letitia took considerable satisfaction in this. She took Edwin to the cleared piece of ground where the schoolhouse would be built, on an October afternoon that smelled of dried leaves and wood smoke, and said, "This is the thing I'm most proud of this year." Aside from James, Edwin stood looking at the empty lot with his hat in his hands, turning it. "More proud of this than the profit from the fall cattle run," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with an expression that had warmth and pride and a quality of absolute recognition in it. "Why," he said, not challenging, just wanting to hear it. "Because a school stays," she said. "Long after we're gone, children will be learning here. That matters more than a cattle run." He looked back at the lot. "It does," he said. In December of 1880, Edwin came home from a supply run in town with an expression that told her something significant had happened before he'd finished tying his horse. She met him on the porch steps. "Tell me," she said. "Colquhoun is selling his place," he said. "The eastern quarter of his property backs up against our north fence line. 80 acres of good grazing land with a spring-fed pond." He paused. "He's selling it at a fair price because he's leaving to join his son in New Mexico, and he doesn't want the trouble of an auction." She looked at him for a moment, thinking about finances, about what the year had produced, about what the coming year might produce, about the space that 80 acres with a spring-fed pond would give their growing herd. She thought about her own ledger, which she kept with continued meticulous care. "Can we afford it?" she asked. "If we're careful about what we spend in the first half of next year," he said. "We're always careful," she said. "We are," he agreed. "Then let's buy it," she said. Something moved in his face that was close to joy. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell from your expression when you rode in. You had the look of a man hoping his wife will agree to something he's already decided he wants." "That's a very specific look," he said. "You have a very specific face," she said, and he gave her the unguarded smile that she kept collecting, and she felt the same warmth she always felt when he gave it to her, undiminished by familiarity, if anything increased by it. They bought the Colquhoun parcel in January of 1881, and with it the Wainwright Fletcher Ranch, as it was now listed in the county records, expanded to 540 acres. Edwin updated the survey stakes himself, walking the new property line on a cold January morning, while his breath made clouds in the air, and his boots broke through the skin of frost on the grass. And Letitia rode beside him on the gray mare, who was no longer a borrowed horse but deeply and specifically hers, and they covered the ground together in the early light. Spring came and brought everything spring brought, the work of a new cattle season. The bluebonnets coming up in great drifts of blue and violet in the south pasture, James Fletcher learning to walk at 13 months, and doing so with an aggressive confidence that both his parents recognized without needing to discuss which of them he'd gotten it from. He was an emphatic and curious child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's way of attending to things, and he had, from a very young age, a strong and unambiguous opinion about anything he encountered. Cody Marsh fell in love in the spring of 1881 with a young woman from town named Ellen Beaumont, who was the daughter of Harold Beaumont of the general store, and was 20 and practical and good-tempered, and clearly charmed by Cody's uncomplicated and wholehearted affection. This development was received at the ranch with general satisfaction, and Letitia hosted the couple for Sunday dinners on several occasions, with the frank and unabashed pleasure of a woman who takes delight in seeing love grow in her orbit. Edwin watched Cody navigate the uncertain business of courtship with the tolerant amusement of a man who has survived his own version of it and emerged better than when he went in. He offered no advice except once, when Cody was struggling with what to say to Ellen about something that mattered, and Edwin said only this: "Say it plainly. Women worth knowing appreciate plain." Cody looked at him. "Is that what you did?" "It's all I know how to do," Edwin said, and it worked out. The summer of 1881 was the best the ranch had seen. The herd was strong, the land was in excellent condition, and the 3 seasons of careful management had built a property that was not merely surviving but genuinely thriving. Letitia's ledger told the story with the precision she had maintained from the beginning, and when she totaled the columns at the end of July, she arrived at a number that made her sit for a long moment in the quiet of the ranch office, which had been the sitting room originally, and now held a desk and shelves of books, and the ledger books that were the ranch's record of its own existence. She brought the open ledger to Edwin that evening, setting it on the kitchen table between them after supper while James slept in the nursery, and the summer dusk was long and gold outside the windows. Edwin looked at the bottom line. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "2 years ago you spent everything you had on this land." "I did," she said. "And now," she said. He looked at her across the table, across the ledger, across the sum of everything they had built together in the years since a Tuesday auction and a conversation in the Silver Spur, and a cold December night in a barn, and his expression was so full of love, and of something that she thought was closest to wonder, at the improbability of it, at the specific grace of how each piece had fallen, that she had to look down at the table and then back up at him, because the directness of it was almost too much to hold all at once. "Letitia," he said. "Edwin," she said. "I am the luckiest man in the state of Texas," he said. She laughed, the real sudden laugh, and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You are a very good rancher," she said. "That had something to do with it." "We are," he said. "We are a very good ranch." She thought about that, the word "we," the way it had accumulated meaning over 3 years, the way it had grown from a business arrangement made across a saloon table into something that was the primary organizing fact of her existence. She thought about how she had sat in the middle of the street the afternoon of the auction feeling the weight of what she'd done, and how that weight had turned out not to be a burden but a foundation. "Yes," she said, We are. The autumn of 1881 brought a second pregnancy, which advanced with the same uncomplicated straightforwardness as the first, and by March of 1882 a daughter arrived. She was born in the same sound bedroom as her brother, with the same Dr. Holt and Mrs. Henley in attendance, and this time Edwin was permitted to remain in the room rather than wearing holes in the porch with his pacing. He held her daughter's hand through the difficult hours with a steadiness that she would later tell him was better than anything any doctor could have provided. And when the baby arrived in the late afternoon, and Dr. Holt placed the child in Edwin's arms, the man who had lost so much and built so much and stood so steady through all of it had tears on his face that he didn't bother to conceal. They named her Clara, after the merchant's wife who had stood next to Letitia at the auction, and made the offhand remark that had set the whole improbable chain in motion. When Letitia explained this to Edwin, lying in bed the evening after Clara's birth with the baby asleep in the cradle that Edwin had made, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "We should send Mrs. Hobbs a letter." "I already planned to," Letitia said. "Of course you did," he said, with the warmth of a man who knows his wife well and loves what he knows. James Fletcher, 2 years old and already a force to be reckoned with, received his sister with the polite suspicion of a person whose sole dominion has been infringed upon, but by the end of the week he had positioned himself as her dedicated if somewhat overbearing protector, a role he would grow into with considerable commitment. Maria Salinas came every morning to help, and the house was full of the noise and motion and warmth of people who are glad to be where they are. The years settled into a pattern that was full and substantial and built of the same materials as the ranch itself: good work, and honest living, and the kind of love that doesn't diminish with familiarity but deepens, because familiarity has not been a disappointment. Edwin Fletcher was not, as he had told her at the beginning, easy company, in the sense of being uncomplicated or without depth. He was instead the kind of company that required and rewarded full attention, the kind of person who grew in your estimation rather than diminishing as you knew him better, because what was underneath was better than the surface, and the surface was already considerable. He had, over the years, put Pearl properly to rest, not forgotten, not replaced, but laid to rest in the way a person can be when the people who love them allow themselves to stop carrying the grief as punishment and start carrying it as what it properly is, which is love with nowhere to go and which deserves to be set down gently. He had told Letitia this, on a quiet evening in the summer of 1882, sitting on the porch with the children asleep and the stars out and the ranch breathing around them in the dark. He had said it plainly because that was all he knew how to do, and she had listened plainly because that was what the situation required, and they had sat afterward in the particular stillness of people who have exchanged something that matters and are allowing it to settle. Then he said, "I thought for a long time that being happy again was a betrayal." "I know," she said. "It isn't," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for being patient while I figured that out." "You weren't slow," she said. "You were careful. Those are different things." He turned and looked at her in the lamplight from the open doorway. "How did you know that?" "That first night when you came to find me, that I was worth the asking." She thought about it honestly. "I didn't know," she said. "Mrs. Henley told me you were worth it, and I trusted her judgment, and then I trusted my own." "And was she right?" he said. She looked at him, this man, this particular man, with his dark eyes and his careful honesty and his way of standing fully in whatever he'd committed to, and said with complete simplicity, "She was right about everything." The ranch turned its fourth full year in the fall of 1882 with a cattle run that went to San Antonio, and returned with a sum that Letitia recorded in her ledger with a flourish she didn't usually allow herself. Edwin read the number over her shoulder, standing behind her in the ranch office with his hands on the back of her chair, and said nothing for a moment, and then pressed his lips to the top of her head in the way he had of expressing a satisfaction too large for words. Cody Marsh and Ellen Beaumont had married in the spring of that year, and were living in a small place east of town, Cody having taken a foreman's position at a growing ranch south of Redemption Creek. He still came back to the Fletcher Ranch for Sunday dinners when he could, and those occasions were always loud and good, with James Fletcher treating Cody with the uncomplicated hero worship of a small boy for a man who was always willing to get down on his knees and examine an interesting rock or a particularly fine stick, and Clara Fletcher regarding all adult proceedings from a position of serene assessment that both her parents found both familiar and faintly disconcerting. Tom, the enigmatic man from Arkansas whose last name remained officially unspecified, had stayed and showed every indication of staying indefinitely. He had become, over the years, a foundational presence on the property, not a talker, not a demonstrative man, but reliable in the way that rock is reliable, there when you need it and not inclined to collapse. Edwin valued him deeply and showed this in practical ways, in fair wage, and in the small acknowledgments that a man like Tom actually read and appreciated. Rodrigo and Maria Salinas had made their little house on the eastern edge of the property into something lovely, with Maria's kitchen garden flourishing and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, growing up alongside James and Clara in the way of children raised in proximity to good-hearted adults, which is to say largely well, and with excellent instincts for what matters. Letitia and Maria had built a friendship of genuine depth and daily texture, the kind that forms between people who spend their time in practical company and find, in the middle of real work and real difficulty, that they like and respect each other enormously. The small community that had grown up around the Fletcher Ranch was not perfect, nothing was perfect, but it was good. It was the kind of goodness that doesn't announce itself, that lives in the ordinary round of shared meals and common work, and the accumulated moments of one person helping another, because it is needed and possible. And Letitia was aware of this goodness in the specific way of a woman who had come from somewhere smaller and found something larger than she had thought to look for. On the 5th anniversary of the auction, the first Tuesday of September, 1883, Edwin saddled their horses in the morning without explanation and told her to come with him. She came because she had learned that when Edwin had a plan it was generally worth following. He rode them out to the rise above the ranch, the same rise where she had stopped her horse on the first morning she'd come to see the property, and they stopped there in the September morning, the sky that same enormous blue it had been that day, the land spreading out in all directions, the creek's cottonwoods marking the north boundary, the south pasture full of the herd. The house was sound and warm. The barn was better than new. The fences ran straight. The cattle moved in the south pasture below them with the ease of animals that are well kept and well fed on good land. The smoke house worked. The root cellar was full. The small house on the east edge where the Salinas family lived had smoke rising from its chimney. The bunkhouse where Tom lived and where Edwin had lived that first year had new boards and a solid roof. 5 years, Edwin said. 5 years, she agreed. He looked at the property for a long moment. You know what's funny, he said. Tell me, she said. The day Dunmore died and I knew the bank would take the place, I spent about a week thinking this land was just going to fall into the wrong hands. Someone who'd work it wrong, or not work it at all, or subdivide it. He paused. I thought about bidding on it myself, but I didn't have the money and I didn't much care what happened to me at that point. Edwin, she said softly. And then you walked into the Silver Spur, he said, and told me you'd bought a ranch by accident, and I thought, well, that's either going to be a disaster or it's going to be something else. He looked at her and the morning light was on his face, and his eyes were dark and warm and entirely here, entirely present, in the way she had always loved most about him. It was something else. She looked at the land, at her land, at their land, and thought about all the roads that had led here, the cousin's invitation and the move west and the boring Tuesday morning and the impulsive raised hand and Mrs. Henley's advice and the whiskey glass turning in a man's hand and a cold barn and a December Christmas and all the mornings and evenings and work and weather and love between then and now. "Edwin," she said. "Letitia," he said. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The morning after the auction," she said, "when I was walking home and it landed on me what I'd done, I was scared. Not frightened exactly, more like standing on the edge of something very large and not being sure of my footing. I know the feeling," he said, "but I remember thinking," she said, "that the only way to find out if the footing was sound was to step forward." He looked at her. "And it was," she said. "The footing was sound." He reached out and took her hand, the same gesture from the same impulse as the barn, as Christmas, as all the times before, steady and certain in his. The gray mare shifted under her, and the bay stood quiet beside it, and the ranch spread out below them in the September morning, alive and working and well. James's voice carried up from below. He was 5 and opinionated, and apparently had something urgent to communicate to Rodrigo's eldest boy about the horse trough, and Clara was no doubt inside with Maria, regarding the bread-making with the focused critical attention she brought to all processes she considered worth studying. Tom was somewhere on the south fence line with the unhurried competence that defined everything he did. The cattle moved on the grass of the south pasture, healthy and well-directed. The house waited below with its good roof and its warm kitchen, and its office with the careful ledger books, and its shelves of novels, and its nursery with the walnut cradle that had held 2 children and might hold more. Edwin squeezed her hand once and she squeezed back, and they sat together on the rise above everything they had built, the woman who had raised her hand on a joke and the man who had said yes when he might have said no, and the land lay before them in the September light, patient and full and enduring, asking nothing of them except to stay. They stayed. In the years that followed, the Fletcher Ranch became what good places become when they are built by good people and tended with genuine care. A place with a character, a reputation, a kind of gravity that drew good things toward it. A third child, another boy, came in 1884, named Thomas after the quiet Arkansan who had been part of the ranch since near the beginning, a gesture that caused Tom himself to excuse himself from the kitchen and stand outside for approximately 10 minutes before returning with his face composed and his eyes somewhat brighter than usual. They called the baby Thomas James Fletcher, and he arrived in the world with the same dark eyes as his father and the same quality of attending carefully before committing to an opinion. The school that Letitia had helped push through in 1880 had grown into a proper 2-room institution by 1885, with a second teacher and a library that Letitia had helped stock by writing letters to publishers in the East and arguing, with her customary direct persistence, that frontier children deserved access to the same quality of reading material as children in Boston or New York. She won this argument the way she won most arguments, by being both right and unwilling to stop. Edwin served on the town's water board from 1883 onward, because he understood water in the way that a man who has built a working ranch understands it, as the single most important resource a community has, and his work on that board did more for the practical welfare of Redemption Creek than any number of more dramatic contributions. They grew old together in the way of people who have chosen correctly, and who have treated that choice as an ongoing act rather than a completed one, finding in each other, year by year, not less than they had expected but more, because the people you love most are always slightly larger than any conception of them you've managed to form. James Fletcher grew up to be a rancher in the same bone-deep way his father was, with the same quality of attention to land and animals and honest work, though with his mother's particular sharpness of mind and her ability to hold an argument until it was properly resolved. Clara Fletcher became a teacher, which no one who had watched her studying Maria Salinas's bread-making with critical attention at the age of 3 was particularly surprised by. Thomas Fletcher, the youngest, had his father's quietness and his mother's warmth, and grew up to be a man whose company was valued by everyone who knew him, which is a good way to be. The ranch itself, in the county records and on the land, bore the name that had been put there in the first year, Wainwright Fletcher Ranch, and it kept that name through every transaction and every season and every generation that came after. Letitia had insisted on the Wainwright part, not from pride but from accuracy, because she was the one who had raised her hand at the auction, and accuracy mattered to her. Edwin, asked about it once by a neighboring rancher who found the double name unusual, said simply that the ranch was his wife's land as much as his own in every sense that mattered. The neighboring rancher considered this, and then said he supposed that was fair. Edwin said yes. It was. In the long evenings of their later years, when the children were grown and the ranch was in good hands, and the work was lighter than it had been, Edwin and Letitia would sit on the porch in the way they'd been sitting on porches together since that first September, and watch the sun go down over the western hills, and the land would lie quiet around them in the dusk, and the creek would talk in the cottonwoods, and the stars would come out one by one in the enormous Texas sky. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. They had been talking and not talking together for long enough that both were equally comfortable. On one such evening, some years after the children had grown and gone about their lives, Letitia said, out of nowhere and for no particular reason except that it had come into her mind, "Do you remember when you asked me why I raised my hand at the auction? I asked you that the first day," he said, "on the ride out. You said same thing," she said, "when I told you it wasn't exactly a joke, more of an impulse." "It was the same thing," he said. "A joke you commit to is just a decision you haven't caught up with yet," she laughed. "I've thought about that a great deal over the years." "Have you?" he said. "I think," she said slowly, watching the last of the sunset color fade from the western ridge, "that the real truth is that it wasn't a joke. I think somewhere underneath the impulse, some part of me looked at that land and wanted it, wanted to belong to something that large and that real." She paused. "I just didn't have the courage of it yet, so it came out as a joke." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think that's right." She looked at him. "The night you came to the Silver Spur," he said, "I was sitting there looking at that whiskey glass and thinking there wasn't much point to anything in particular. And then you walked in and sat down and told me you'd accidentally bought a ranch, and the whole thing was so—" He paused, and the corner of his mouth moved. "It was so improbable. It was so exactly like something a person does when they're more alive than they know." "More alive than I know," she said, turning it over. "That's what I thought," he said. "About you, that very first night. That here was a woman who was more alive than she'd figured out yet." She looked at him for a long moment, in the dusk with the first stars appearing and the creek moving in the distance, and the land around them quiet and inhabited and deeply, entirely theirs. "Edwin Fletcher," she said. "Letitia Fletcher," he said, because he had called her that since the day they'd married, and it still had a warmth in it that had not diminished. "We did good," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture of 30-odd years and unchanging in its quality, steady, certain his. "We did," he said. "We did very good." The stars came out above the Wainwright Fletcher Ranch, and the creek talked in the cottonwoods, and the land lay still and good under the rising dark, and the two of them sat on the porch in the long company of each other, and the evening deepened around them like everything fine that accumulates slowly, year by year, when you are paying attention and not letting go.